I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
The morning fog over Lochdubh was as thick, grey, and impenetrable as a bowl of week-old porridge. It rolled off the sea loch in heavy, silent banks, wrapping the jagged peaks of the mountains in a damp embrace and suffocating the village in a profound, ghostly quiet. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth found the weather utterly magnificent. Fog meant visibility was down to a mere 10 feet. And when visibility was down to 10 feet, not a soul in the village could see a lanky, red-haired policeman illegally pulling a magnificent, silver-scaled salmon from the waters of the river. "Quiet now, lugs," Hamish whispered, though the small, scruffy dog at his feet had done nothing more than twitch an ear. Hamish expertly slipped the poached prize into a battered canvas sack. He stood up, stretching his long, bony frame against the chill of the Highland frost that clung to the grass beneath the mist. His stomach gave a low, mournful rumble. The fish would make a fine supper, but right now his soul cried out for a cup of brutally strong coffee and a moment of absolute peace. He ambled back toward the police station, his hazel eyes alert despite the deliberately shuffling, lazy gait he adopted out of pure habit. The station was a small, whitewashed building that usually represented an unwelcome interruption to his day. As he pushed open the back door, the shrill, demanding ring of the telephone shattered the quiet. Hamish froze. He stared at the black rotary phone on his desk as if it were a venomous snake. It would be Detective Chief Inspector Blair ringing from headquarters in Strathbane. It was always Blair, usually purple-faced and shouting about incomplete paperwork, stolen sheep, or demanding to know why crime in Lochdubh was so suspiciously low. Hamish knew that if he answered, he would be given a task. If he completed the task efficiently, Blair might accidentally give him a good performance review. A good review meant the looming, terrifying threat of a promotion to the grimy, violent city streets of Strathbane. A fate Hamish considered worse than death. He waited. 7 rings. 8, 9. Silence. Hamish exhaled a long breath, scratched lugs behind the ears, and smiled. Right then. Coffee. Leaving the salmon in the cool larder, Hamish strolled down the waterfront toward the Lochdubh Hotel. The fog was beginning to thin slightly, revealing the grey stone cottages and the dark, icy waters of the loch. He pushed open the hotel's heavy wooden doors, anticipating the warmth of the roaring fire and the bitter perfection of Mr. Wellington's coffee. Instead, he was met with the shrill, carrying the voice of an Englishman deeply offended by the existence of the Scottish Highlands. "I am simply asking," the voice barked, "why it is completely impossible to get a decent signal in this god-forsaken hamlet, and why the local populace insists on using my private driveway as a public thoroughfare." Hamish sighed inwardly. He slouched into the lounge, adopting an expression of profound, cow-like stupidity. Standing at the reception was Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was a retired London property developer who had descended upon Lochdubh 2 weeks prior, having purchased the old MacLeod estate on a whim. He was entirely devoid of a luxury car, having famously crashed his Range Rover into a ditch outside of Inverness, and had arrived in Lochdubh on the back of a sputtering farmer's tractor, clutching a ridiculous set of matching tweed luggage. Despite the undignified arrival, Pendleton had spent every day since treating the villagers like a collection of particularly slow-witted servants. He was currently dressed in brand new, offensively stiff tartan that smelled of a London tailor rather than peat and heather. "Ah, the local constabulary," Pendleton sneered as Hamish approached. "About time, Macbeth, isn't it?" "Aye, sir," Hamish said, letting his Highland drawl thicken until it was almost entirely vowels. He slumped against the reception desk, looking as though his own spine was too exhausting to support. "Mornin', Mr. Pendleton. Grand day for it. Grand day. It's freezing, and I can't see my own hand in front of my face." Pendleton snapped. "I want to report a trespass. Old Mrs. Gallagher and her infernal terrier walked right past my sitting room window this morning. I've put up private property signs. 3 of them." "Well now," Hamish said slowly, scratching his red hair under his peaked cap. "Mrs. Gallagher's been walking that path since before the war, sir." It's a public right-of-way, ye see. It is my land now. I paid £500,000 for that estate, and I will not have peasants peering into my windows. I demand you go round and give her an official warning." Mr. Wellington, standing behind the reception desk, caught Hamish's eye. The hotel manager looked as though he would very much like to introduce Mr. Pendleton's head to a cast iron skillet. Hamish wanted nothing to do with this. If he started issuing warnings to 80-year-old women over ancient walking paths, Blair would hear of it, drag him to Strathbane, and probably make him sit through a seminar on rural property law. "I'll be sure to make a note of it in the official logbook, sir," Hamish lied smoothly, his face a mask of amiable vacuity. "A very serious matter, trespass. I'll need to fill out form 7-B. In triplicate, might take a few weeks to process through Strathbane. What with the fog and all." Pendleton stared at him, his face reddening. "You are completely useless, aren't you?" "Aye, sir. That's what the Chief Inspector says," Hamish agreed cheerfully. "Could I trouble ye for a pot of coffee, Mr. Wellington?" Pendleton let out a sound of pure aristocratic disgust, grabbed his walking stick, and stormed out of the hotel, the heavy door banging loudly behind him. Hamish watched him go, the lazy facade dropping for just a fraction of a second, his sharp eyes calculating. The Lochdubh villagers were tolerant, but had their limits. In the past 2 weeks, Pendleton had insulted the minister, threatened to sue the local shopkeeper over the price of a newspaper, and fenced off the best blackberry bushes in the glen. "That man," Mr. Wellington muttered, pouring a steaming cup of black coffee and sliding it across the polished wood, "is going to get himself hurt if he isn't careful." "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that," Hamish murmured, wrapping his cold hands around the warm ceramic mug. He took a long, appreciative sip, though a small, dark instinct prickled at the back of his neck. "But I do hope he learns to mind his manners. I've got enough paperwork to avoid it as it is." Or the fog that had smothered Lochdubh all morning finally surrendered to a biting, crystalline evening. A brilliant canopy of stars stretched over the Highlands, reflecting off the dark glass of the loch. Inside the police station, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his favourite evening activity. Absolutely nothing. He was slouched deep into his battered armchair, a bowl of perfectly poached salmon and potato stew resting on his knees. The cast-iron stove radiated a glorious heat, and lugs was a snoring pile of scruff on the hearth rug. Hamish took a slow, reverent bite of the stew. It was magnificent. The world was at peace. The paperwork was safely ignored in a locked drawer, and Strathbane headquarters had not called in over 10 hours. He closed his eyes, preparing to savour the next spoonful. Then came the frantic hammering knock at the station door. Hamish froze, his spoon hovering inches from his mouth. "Go away," he muttered to the wooden door. The knocking redoubled, accompanied by a breathless, reedy voice. "Hamish, are ye in there? Hamish, it's Willie." Hamish let out a heavy sigh, setting the bowl aside. He mourned the stew already. It would be cold and congealed by the time he returned. "I'm coming. Keep your hair on," he called out, his Highland drawl thick with irritation. He hauled himself out of the chair, tugged his uniform tunic over his slightly stained wool sweater, and pulled open the door. Willie Lamont, the baker's assistant, stood on the frost-hardened step. The boy was gasping for air, his face the colour of unbaked dough. He pointed a trembling finger up the hill toward the old MacLeod estate. "It's the Sassenach," Willie panted, his eyes wide with horror. "Mr. Pendleton, he's dead, Hamish, in the bushes." "Dead?" Hamish asked, his voice deliberately slow. "Are ye sure he isn't just taking a rest, Willie? People don't rest headfirst in the brambles wearing a silk dressing gown." Willie shrieked. "Right then," Hamish said, scratching his head. "Suppose I'd better come take a look." He whistled for lugs, grabbed his flashlight, and followed Willie up the steep, winding lane. The biting wind whipped at Hamish's exposed ears, putting him in an even fouler mood. Why did people insist on getting murdered after supper? It was terribly inconsiderate. When they reached the boundary of Pendleton's property, Hamish directed his flashlight beam into the thick, thorny mass of blackberry bushes the Englishman had so aggressively fenced off only days before. Willie was entirely correct. Arthur Pendleton was exceptionally dead. It was undeniably humiliating. Pendleton was wedged upside down in the thicket. He was wearing an absurdly expensive emerald green silk dressing gown, his bare, knobbly calves exposed to the freezing Highland air. One of his feet was bare, the other clad in a velvet slipper embroidered with a gold crest. A pair of silver pruning shears lay discarded on the frosted grass near his dangling hand. He looked like an exotic, overgrown bird that had crash-landed in the shrubbery. Hamish stepped closer, his face slack and expressionless, masking the rapid calculations firing behind his hazel eyes. "Don't touch anything, Willie," he murmured, his tone mild. He shone the light closer. The brambles were thick, but they hadn't killed him. Pendleton's face, visible through the thorny branches, was a mottled, ghastly purple, his eyes bulging grotesquely. Around his neck, tightly twisted and cutting deep into the flesh, was a length of the very same shiny galvanized wire he had used to fence off the property. Hamish squatted down, looking as though he might fall asleep right there on the grass. In reality, he was absorbing every detail. The frost on the ground was disturbed, but only on one side of the bushes. There was a smear of mud on the hem of the silk gown, a peculiar rust-colored mud found only near the peat bogs, nowhere near this estate. And then there was the slipper. Why would a man go pruning in the freezing dark in a silk gown and only one shoe? He hadn't been killed here. He had been killed elsewhere, dragged here, and unceremoniously dumped over the very fence he built. Hamish stood up slowly, joints cracking, and let out a long, mournful sigh that had nothing to do with the loss of human life, and everything to do with the loss of his peaceful evening. A murder meant Strathbane. Strathbane meant the imminent arrival of DCI Blair. "Well, Willie," Hamish said, adopting his best tone of helpless Highland bewilderment, "it looks like the poor man has had a terrible accident with his fencing. I suppose I'd best go to Ring headquarters. And my stew is going to be ruined, eh?" The siren arrived before the squad cars did, a mournful, high-pitched wail that shattered the silence of the glen and echoed off the mountains, driving the local sheep into a panicked frenzy. Hamish stood by the entrance to the MacLeod estate, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn, olive-green police tunic, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus that was never going to arrive. He didn't have to wait long. Two police cruisers skidded to a halt on the gravel, their tires spraying loose stones across the driveway. From the lead vehicle, DCI Blair emerged, unfolding his thick, bullish frame like a piece of poorly manufactured machinery. His face, usually a shade of irritated pink, was currently a vibrant, apoplectic purple. "Macbeth," Blair roared, his voice booming across the quiet hillside and startling a raven from a nearby pine. "I've heard of being slow, but this is beyond the pale. I am told there is a body, and I am told you are currently occupying the scene, doing absolutely nothing, but standing there looking like a scarecrow in search of a brain." Hamish blinked, his expression carefully calibrated to convey a mix of confusion and mild alarm. "Mornin', Chief Inspector. I was just keeping the site secure." "Like, secure? You're standing in the middle of a crime scene, holding a bag of lukewarm fish and chips." "Man," Blair marched over, his heavy boots crushing the frost-hardened mud. He stopped inches from Hamish's face, his eyes bulging with genuine, unadulterated loathing. This man was an influential investor. He was a pillar of the community, and he's been found dead on your watch. In your village, likely due to your complete and utter lack of oversight. "He arrived only a fortnight ago, sir," Hamish ventured softly. "Hardly had time to become a pillar, and he was a bit of a terror to the neighbors, truth be told." Blair's face darkened further. "I don't care if he was the ghost of Bonnie Prince Charlie himself. A murder is a stain on my department, and you, Macbeth, are the ink that made it. I want him identified, I want the scene processed, and I want you out of my sight. Go find somewhere else to be useless." Behind Blair, a team of junior officers from Strathbane began spilling out of the second car, lugging heavy high-tech evidence cases. that looked completely out of place against the backdrop of the rugged ancient hills. They tripped over the uneven grass and cursed, while Blair continued his tirade. He was in his element, which meant he was entirely focused on the wrong things. Obviously, Blair sneered, gesturing vaguely at the body in the thicket with a gloved hand. It was a robbery gone wrong. Local hooligans. Someone wanted his money. They tried to rob him. He resisted, and they strangled him. It's as plain as the nose on your face, Macbeth. Though I suppose for you that's a complex concept. He had his watch on, sir, Hamish noted, his tone drifting off as if he were discussing the weather, and his wallet was in his robe pocket, full of cash. By the looks of it, Blair spun around, his finger jabbing at Hamish's chest. Don't you dare contradict me. I am the Detective Chief Inspector, and you are a country bumpkin who has spent his career avoiding anything resembling actual work. Maybe they panicked. Maybe they were interrupted. It doesn't matter why they didn't take the money. It matters that they are here in your village, and you are going to help me find them by staying completely, utterly silent. Do you understand? I, Chief Inspector. Perfectly. Blair turned his back on him, satisfied with his own brilliance. He spent the next hour barking orders, demanding tea, and complaining about the lack of signal for his radio. He focused entirely on the local villagers who had begun to gather at the edge of the property, shouting at them to move along, while simultaneously demanding they explain why they were there. Hamish watched from the periphery, his eyes scanning the mud around the thicket. Blair's team was trampling over everything, their heavy boots obliterating any footprints that might have remained in the soft, peat-rich soil near the fence line. It was a disaster, a masterclass in how to ruin a crime scene. But as Hamish looked at the way the wire had been wound tight, precise, almost surgical, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no work of a panicked, clumsy thief. It was personal and deliberate. You're making a right mess of it, Blair, Hamish whispered to himself, though the wind carried the words away. He looked toward the village, his mind already drifting to who might have had the most reason to hate the man in the dressing gown. Blair wanted a quick arrest to appease his superiors and secure a pat on the back, and he didn't care who he ruined to get it. Hamish, conversely, only wanted the truth, because the truth was the only way to get back to his tea. He tucked his hands back into his pockets, let his posture slump further, and began to slowly, invisibly, drift toward the gate. He had a village to talk to, and he knew exactly where to find the first cup of tea. The village of Lochdubh was not a place where secrets stayed buried for long, though they did tend to grow roots in the damp, peat-heavy soil. Hamish Macbeth knew that if you wanted to know who had killed a man, you didn't look at the crime scene. You looked at the kitchen tables. People in the Highlands were notoriously tight-lipped with the police, but they were remarkably generous with the local constable, especially when that constable was looking appropriately hungry and pitiable. Hamish bypassed the chaos of the MacLeod estate and trudged down to the small, cosy cottage of Mrs. Jesperson, the village postmistress. She was a woman who knew everyone's business, mostly because she was the one who delivered the bills, the love letters, and the summons that dictated the rhythm of local life. Hamish, she said, opening the door and immediately stepping back to make room. I heard the sirens. The village is buzzing like a hive in a thunderstorm. Come in, the kettle is just boiling. Hamish didn't need to be asked twice. He sat at her scarred oak table, his long legs folded awkwardly beneath it, and waited while she poured him a cup of tea so strong it could have stood a spoon upright. He did not ask about murder. He simply looked tired, defeated, and vaguely pathetic. Blair's been at the estate all night, Hamish said, blowing on his tea. He's in the right state. Reckons it was a burglary. Poor man. Mrs. Jesperson let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. A burglary? That man wouldn't know a thief if he tripped over 1 inch his own hallway. Arthur Pendleton had no enemies in the city. Maybe, but he had a whole village full of them here. He was a nasty piece. Hamish. Just this morning, he was at the post office demanding. I stopped the delivery of letters from his disgraced nephew. Said he was cutting him out of the will entirely. Hamish took a slow sip, his face revealing nothing. A nephew. I hadn't heard of a nephew. Neither had anyone else until he arrived 3 days ago, she replied, leaning in. A nervous lad kept his head down. Pendleton was shouting at him in the square, calling him a spunger and a waste of space. It was quite a scene. Hamish thanked her, finished his tea, and made his way to the only other place where the truth circulated as freely as the gossip, the local curry shop run by the Patel family. It was a strange fixture in the remote Highlands, but it was the heart of the village's social life. He found Ali Patel behind the counter, tossing nasan into the tandoor. "Hamish," Ali greeted, offering a warm smile. "The air is thick with rumours today. They say the Sassenach is dead." "Aye," Hamish said, slumping onto a stool. "Blair's got the whole village under his thumb, shouting and red-faced. I'm just looking for a bit of lunch. Anything left?" Ali slid a plate of spicy lamb curry and a stack of fresh naan toward him. "You look like you need it. You know, Pendleton was here yesterday too." He wasn't alone. He was having a very heated discussion with the minister. They were arguing about the old church cemetery wall, the one that borders the Macleod estate. Pendleton wanted it knocked down to make way for a viewing deck. "The minister?" Hamish asked, pausing with a piece of naan midway to his mouth. "Reverend Graves. He's a peaceful man." "Not when it comes to his ancestors, he isn't," Ali said, wiping his hands on an apron. He was shaking, Hamish. "I've never seen him so angry." He told Pendleton that he would see him in hell before he let him touch a single stone of those graves. Hamish chewed thoughtfully, the heat of the spices clearing his head. He looked out the window toward the grey, misty slopes of the mountain. He now had a nephew who stood to lose an inheritance and a minister who was protecting sacred ground. The man had publicly humiliated both. He didn't need forensics. He needed to understand the particular brand of stubbornness that drove people to kill. Blair would focus on the nephew, of course, the obvious choice for a man looking for a motive. He'd probably have the lad in a cell within the hour, sweating under the harsh lights of the police cruiser, while the real killer went about their day, perhaps even feeling a strange, hollow sense of relief. Hamish finished his meal, thanked Ali, and stepped back out into the sharp, biting air. He didn't feel like a detective. He felt like a man who was getting closer to a truth he didn't particularly want to face. The deeper he dug into the mooching investigation, the more he realized that in Lochdubh, every secret was tied to the land or the blood, and both were very difficult to wash. He started the slow walk back to the station, wondering how he could possibly steer Blair away from the nephew without actually doing his job well enough to get promoted. It was a delicate, miserable, and utterly necessary dance. The romantic life of Hamish Macbeth was, by all accounts, a disaster of epic Highland proportions. It was a chaotic landscape defined by unattainable women, missed opportunities, and the crushing realization that being a village constable with a penchant for poaching and a pathological fear of ambition was not, in fact, the height of desirability. Hamish was currently leaning against a fence post at the edge of the village, watching the clouds gather over the sea loch. His thoughts were occupied by the case, but his mood was being thoroughly ruined by the unexpected appearance of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. Priscilla was the daughter of the local grandee, and quite possibly the only woman in the Highlands who could make Hamish feel simultaneously brilliant and utterly inadequate. She pulled her sleek, sensible Land Rover to a halt beside him, her window rolling down to reveal a face that was as sharp and refined as a Highland winter. "Hamish," she said, her voice cool and clipped, "I hear there's been a murder, and I hear the local police are currently busy making fools of themselves. As per usual." "Morning, Priscilla," Hamish said, attempting to look as though he were busy studying the horizon. "Blair's in charge. It's a bit of a circus. So I heard. My father mentioned that the Strathbane police are looking for some nephew of the deceased. A complete waste of time, I should think." She stepped out of the vehicle, her tweed coat perfectly tailored, her presence commanding the very air around them. She looked at him with an expression of mild, habitual pity. The man was a bully, Hamish, but he wasn't a fool. Why would he be walking around his own estate in a silk dressing gown at midnight? Hamish shrugged, his posture intentionally slouchy. Maybe he liked the night air, Some people are eccentric. Nonsense, she snapped. People are rarely eccentric when they're dead. They're usually just compromised. She walked closer, her gaze narrowing as she took in his disheveled uniform and the slightly guilty set of his shoulders. You've been talking to people, haven't you? That's your version of detective work. The mooching method. Hamish grinned, a slow, disarming expression that did absolutely nothing to soften his appearance. It gets the job done, doesn't it? It gets you in trouble, Hamish. You're playing a dangerous game. Blair wants conviction, not truth. If he finds his nephew, he'll wrap this up, and you'll be left with a mystery that you know deep down is still burning. She sighed, leaning against the hood of her vehicle. The Pendleton man wasn't just a nuisance. He was involved in a private business deal with local property owners. My father was one of them. They were trying to force a buyout of the adjacent lands, and Pendleton was the lead negotiator. He was ruthless. Hamish felt a jolt of interest, a buyout. I didn't know the estate owners were working with him. They had to. He had the capital. But it was a mess. He was playing them against one another, trying to drive the price down, then threatening to walk away unless they gave him additional land rights. She turned her gaze to the mountains. It wasn't about the nephew, Hamish. It was about the greed of the people who think they own the scenery. And what about the minister? Hamish asked, testing the waters. He was at odds with him over the cemetery. Priscilla glanced at him, her eyes unreadable. Reverend Graves is a man of principle, but he's also a man who has lost his congregation, his funding, and his voice. He's desperate. People do irrational things when they're desperate. Desperate? Hamish repeated, tasting the word. Like murder? Like anything, she replied. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small folded piece of paper, and held it out to him. I found this in the guest book at the estate. I was there this morning, checking on the arrangements for the village council. It's a note, Hamish. It wasn't intended for public eyes. Hamish took the note. It was a brief, jagged message, written in shaky handwriting. The debt will be paid in blood, not coin. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Why are you giving me this? Because, she said, climbing back into her vehicle. I don't like it when the police are incompetent. And I don't like it when the wrong person is accused. Sort it out, Hamish. And for heaven's sake, try to look like a real policeman for once. She left, leaving Hamish in the dust. He unfolded the note, his heart racing. The tone was dramatic, almost theatrical. It wasn't the work of a professional, and it certainly wasn't the work of a greedy businessman. It was personal, vengeful, and raw. He stared at the note, his mind beginning to connect the fragments, the nephew's fear, the minister's anger, and now this promise of blood. Blair was looking for a criminal, but Hamish was soul-searching, and as the wind began to howl through the valley, carrying the promise of a coming storm, Hamish knew that the quiet, lazy life he cherished was slipping further and further away. He had the key now, but it was a key that might very well unlock a door he preferred to keep firmly closed. He shoved the note into his pocket and turned back toward the village, the weight of the investigation finally settling onto his shoulders. The atmosphere at the MacLeod estate had soured into something truly wretched. DCI Blair was in his element, which, for him, meant shouting at people until they stopped thinking altogether. He had cornered the nephew, a slight, pale-faced young man named Toby, in the grand parlour. The lad was huddled on a velvet sofa that looked as though it cost more than Hamish's annual salary, his face buried in his hands while Blair loomed over him, red-faced and triumphant. I have the motive, boy, Blair bellowed, the sound vibrating against the antique portraits lining the walls. Greed, the oldest one, inches the book. You knew he was cutting you, so you decided to get there first. You strangled him, dumped him in the bushes, and thought you'd be clear before anyone noticed. But you're not clever, are you? You're just a pathetic amateur murderer. Hamish stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, with his arms crossed, looking remarkably like a man waiting for his laundry to dry. He watched the scene with a heavy, hooded gaze. Toby looked up, his eyes rimmed with red. I arrived last night to plead with him. I saw his car in the drive, but the house was dark. I left. I never saw him alive. Save it for the magistrate, Blair snapped. He turned to his sergeant, who was dutifully jotting down notes with a look of extreme boredom. Get him into the car. We're done here. I want him processed by dawn, Hamish sighed. The sound was soft, but it seemed to irritate Blair more than a shout would have. Chief Inspector, Hamish murmured, shifting his weight. That wire they found in the bushes? The one he was strangled with? Blair whipped around, his jaw tight. What about it, Macbeth? It's a fencing wire. The kid had the tools in his trunk. It's an open and shut case. Why are you still standing there? Don't you have a village to annoy? Well, Hamish said, looking at the ceiling as if checking for spiders. I was just wondering about the wire. That particular brand, the heavy-duty, galvanized sort, hasn't been stocked in the local shop for years. Too expensive for the sheep farmers. See, they use the lighter, cheaper stuff. It's quite a specific bit of hardware. Blair rolled his eyes. So, he bought it in the city. He brought it with him to murder his uncle. It's not exactly a PhD thesis. You idiot. Hamish agreed, his voice growing dangerously pleasant. But I noticed something in the garage earlier. While officers were busy, as Mr. Pendleton had a whole roll of that exact wire. It wasn't in the trunk of the nephew's car. It was sitting on a workbench right next to the shears, and it was covered in dust, thick, undisturbed dust. Blair stopped. He squinted at Hamish. So he had wire on his workbench. That makes it easier for the killer to get their hands on it. What's your point? My point, Hamish continued, his tone still mild, is that if the nephew brought the wire to commit the murder, he wouldn't have gone out to the garage to fetch his uncle's own dusty supplies. He would have used what he brought. But the wire on the neck was clean, no dust, and the coil on the workbench was missing exactly 3 feet, the length required to make a ligature. Blair turned purple. You're suggesting he didn't use his own. Maybe he wanted to hide his supplies. It doesn't prove anything. And then, Hamish added, ignoring the outburst, there's the matter of the nephew's coat. I saw him arrive at the hotel this morning. He was wearing that thick wool overcoat. It's covered in mud, but the mud on the victim's dressing gown. The stuff I found near the bog is red clay. There's not a speck of red clay on the nephew's coat. The lad's been walking around the village, the hotel, the square. Half the population's seen him. He could have changed his clothes. Blair roared, his composure fracturing entirely. He could have, Hamish conceded, but the victim's shoe, the one that was missing. I found it, sir. It wasn't in the nephew's possession. It was sitting on the windowsill of the village vestry, right next to the Reverend's collection of gardening tools. Blair went deadly silent. He looked at the sergeant, then back at Hamish, his face working with fury. He didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to believe that he had been chasing the wrong lead, but the implication was unavoidable. He had been so focused on the easy, obvious villain that he had completely ignored the evidence staring him in the face. Hamish didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked tired, as if the entire affair was a colossal bore. He knew he had just ruined Blair's evening, and he knew it would make the man even more unbearable in the coming hours. But the nephew was safe for the moment. The trap was set, not for a murderer, but for the truth. Blair would have to let the boy go, even if it meant he had to swallow his pride with a glass of bitter, cold water. Hamish turned and began to shuffle out of the parlor, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had bought time, but the real chase was just beginning. The silence, in the wake of Blair's realization, was thick enough to carve with a bread knife. The DCI, forced by the sheer, stubborn logic of Hamish's observation, had barked an order for the nephew to be released. The lad had stumbled out into the night, looking as though he'd been granted a reprieve from the gallows, and Blair had retreated into the estate study, where he could be heard pouring himself a very large, very stiff drink. Hamish, however, had no time for spirits. He slipped out of the estate and into the cooling night, the air tasting of impending rain and wet pine. He knew that the crime wasn't about money. That had been the red herring that distracted the law. Nor was it about the petty property disputes that had littered Pendleton's short tenure in Lochdubh. The truth was something far more fragile, hidden behind the polite, strained smiles of the village. He made his way toward the manse, where Reverend Graves resided. The house was dark, save for a single, flickering lamp in the study. Hamish didn't knock. He knew the back door would be unlocked, as it always was in a village where theft was considered a grave sin against the community. He let himself in, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and stood in the doorway of the study. The Reverend was sitting at his desk, his head bowed, surrounded by stacks of ancient, crumbling parish records. He didn't look up as Hamish entered. He didn't seem surprised. "I found the slipper, Reverend," Hamish said. His voice, quiet in the hollow room. Graves sighed, a sound of profound, weary resignation. He turned his chair around, his face looking older, more lined than it had the day before. "It was never about the cemetery wall, Hamish. You know that, don't you? It was never about the land." "I know," Hamish said, leaning against the doorframe. "It was about shame." The motive, he realized, had been festering for decades. Arthur Pendleton had been no stranger to the village, despite his airs. During his youth, long before he had made his fortune in London, he had lived in the area, a product of a family that had been disgraced by a scandal involving the very church where Graves now preached. The scandal had involved the embezzlement of parish funds, a crime that had ruined the reputation of the local families and forced many to flee into poverty. Pendleton had returned not to settle, but to settle a score. He had been buying up the land specifically to demolish the symbols of the village's past, aiming to erase the physical evidence of his family's history. And in doing so, he had begun to threaten the very foundation of the parish's existence. He hadn't been building a viewing deck. He had been systematically dismantling the village's heritage, piece by piece, document by document. He was going to sell the land to a developer who planned to raise the church. Graves said, his voice barely a whisper. "He told me he would wipe this place off the map. He wanted to turn our home into a playground for the wealthy, to turn our history into a footnote in some brochure. He laughed at me, Hamish. He told me that our prayers were as hollow as our pockets." "And the note?" Hamish asked. "The blood and coin?" "That was my plea," the Reverend admitted, his eyes filling with tears. "I wrote it in a moment of madness. I wanted him to understand that some things are not for sale. But when I visited him last night, he didn't want to talk. He was already planning to finalize the sale today. He insulted my faith, he insulted my father's name, and he threatened to have me evicted from the manse." Hamish watched the man, his heart heavy. He saw no killer in the traditional sense, only a man driven to the edge by a bully who had lost his own soul to greed. But the murder had still happened. The wire, the dragging of the body, the cold, calculating cruelty of the act. That was not the work of a saint, even a desperate one. "You didn't act alone, did you?" Hamish asked. The Reverend looked at him, his gaze steadying. "No, I couldn't have. I don't have the strength. But there are others, Hamish, others who felt the same weight of his malice. We were all being squeezed until we had nothing left to give." Hamish felt the cold grip of reality tighten. It wasn't just a grudge held by a single man. It was a collective, dark resentment that had boiled over. The village hadn't just stood by, it had participated, or perhaps it had turned a blind eye while the deed was done. The hidden motive was a web of shared misery. As he turned to leave, Hamish realized with a sinking feeling that the case was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He had to stop them, not just for justice, but to save the village from its own darkest impulses. He stepped back out into the night, the wind howling around him, knowing that the trap he would set would have to be perfect, or it would consume them all. The Highland wind had whipped itself into a proper frenzy. By the time Hamish Macbeth left the shadowy confines of the manse, it howled through the narrow streets of Lochdubh, rattling the loose slates and carrying the sharp scent of an approaching squall. Hamish pulled his collar against the biting cold. His mind was working with a cold, terrifying clarity that he usually went to great lengths to avoid. Reverend Graves was a desperate man, certainly, but he possessed the physical constitution of a damp paper bag. It took brute strength to strangle a grown man with heavy-duty wire and haul his body over a thorny barricade. The Reverend hadn't done the heavy lifting. Someone else, someone in fiercely protective of the village, and utterly invisible to DCI Blair, had taken the wire into their own hands. Hamish needed to draw them out. Formal questioning was out of the question. Blair would catch wind of it, blunder in, and the tight-knit community would close ranks faster than an oyster, sensing a lemon. No, Hamish had to play dumb. He had to make the killer believe the lazy, incompetent village Bobby had accidentally stumbled onto something dangerous, which could be easily eliminated. He opened the heavy doors of the Lochdubh Hotel. The lounge was mostly empty. The fire burned to embers. Mr. Wellington was behind the mahogany bar, polishing a glass with a deeply troubled expression. A few locals huddled at a corner table, speaking in hushed, nervous tones. Hamish arranged his features into a mask of complete bumbling exhaustion. He slumped onto a bar stool, letting his head loll forward, and let out a dramatic groan. "Rough night, Hamish?" Mr. Wellington asked, his voice deliberately neutral. "A nightmare," Hamish whined, his Highland drawl stretching the vowels until they snapped. "Blair is tearing the estate apart, threatening to sack me because I can't find a muddy footprint. I tell you, I'm ready to hand in my badge and take up poaching full-time." He leaned closer to the bartender, letting a look of childish pride briefly replace his exhaustion. "Though, I suppose I shouldn't be too hard on myself. I did find the one thing the great chief inspector missed." Mr. Wellington paused mid-Polish. The quiet murmuring at the corner table abruptly ceased. The silence in the room was suddenly absolute, thick, and expectant. "Oh?" Wellington asked, his tone carefully casual. "And what might that be?" "The real murder weapon," Hamish whispered, loud enough to be heard perfectly by anyone within 30 feet. "Blair thinks the Sassenach was strangled with the wire found on his neck, but that was just cut to make it look like a crime of opportunity. The real wire was tossed into the peat bog. I found it sticking out of the mud." Hamish took a sip of the whiskey Wellington, silently slid toward him. "But that's not the best part," Hamish continued. "The killer was wearing heavy leather working gloves. The wire snagged on the leather when they pulled it tight. Ripped a great big chunk of the palm right off. It's still on the wire, a thick piece of brown leather with a very specific, bespoke stitching pattern. Mr. Wellington's eyes flicked downward for a split second. It was an involuntary movement, but Hamish caught it. "I bagged it up," Hamish yawned widely. "Left it right in the middle of my desk at the station. I'll hand it to Blair in the morning, when he's less likely to throw a stapler at my head. Let him take the credit. I just want to sleep." Hamish hauled himself off the stool, bid a sloppy goodnight to the room, and stumbled out the door, playing the part of a useless policeman to the absolute hilt. He didn't go home to his warm bed. Instead, he made his way back to the police station. He unlocked the front door, leaving it slightly ajar, an invitation to a thief. He turned off all the lights, unplugged the rotary phone to prevent interruptions from Strathbane, and retreated into the pitch-black shadows of the holding cell. Lugs trotted in after him. Hamish silently scooped the dog into his arms, holding a hand gently over his muzzle. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. The piece of leather was a complete fabrication, a lie spun out of Highland air. But the killer wouldn't know that. If the killer wore bespoke leather gloves, they would panic. They would come to the station to destroy the evidence before dawn. The station was freezing, the iron bars biting through his sweater. Hamish slowed his breathing, merging with the shadows, his hazel eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight at the door. He was no longer the lazy Bobby. In the dark, Hamish Macbeth was the most dangerous creature in the glen. The silence inside the police station was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy sound of Hamish's own breathing, and the occasional mournful howl of the wind rattling the rafters. He sat in the darkness of the holding cell, his long legs drawn up, his back pressed against the cold, damp stone wall. Lugs remained perfectly still in his lap, the dog seeming to understand that the air in the room had shifted, sharpening into something thin and lethal. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then another, the darkness pressing against his eyes. Hamish didn't move. He knew the psychology of a killer under pressure, the desperation of someone who believed they had everything to lose. The bait he had set was too specific, too threatening to ignore. Whoever had killed Arthur Pendleton had done so with a cold, calculated efficiency, and that person would not rest knowing that a fragment of their own clothing was sitting on a desk in an unguarded station, just waiting for the morning light to reveal their identity to DCI Blair. The hinges of the front door gave a tiny, rhythmic squeak, a sound so subtle that in any other context it would have been dismissed as the wind. But the door had been left just slightly ajar, and the movement was deliberate. A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the office, darker than the night outside, and stepped onto the creaky floorboards. The figure moved with the practiced, cautious grace of someone familiar with the layout of the building, sliding toward the desk where Hamish had supposedly left the evidence. Hamish let the intruder reach the center of the room. He could hear the faint, sharp intake of breath as the person reached out toward the desk. He stood up slowly, the movement fluid and silent despite his height. As the figure turned, clearly intending to sweep the top of the desk for the non-existent evidence, Hamish stepped out of the shadow of the cell. "I wouldn't," Hamish said, his voice quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of his usual lazy drawl. The figure spun around, a startled gasp tearing through the silence. It was Mr. Wellington, the hotelier. The light from the street lamp outside caught his face, stripping away the usual mask of polite, subservient efficiency. His expression was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes wide and wild. He wore a pair of sturdy, leather work gloves. The very gloves Hamish had described as having the telltale snag. "Hamish," Wellington breathed, his voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you, Mr. Wellington," Hamish replied, taking a slow step forward. "I thought you might want to retrieve your evidence. But there's a bit of a problem. You see," I lied. "There was no leather in the bog, and there was no snag on the wire. I just needed to see who would be foolish enough to come looking for it." Wellington's face drained of color, his hand twitching toward his pocket. For a second, the hotel manager looked ready to flee, or perhaps to fight. He was a man who had built a life on the facade of being helpful, of being the one who provided comfort and tea. But underneath that service-oriented exterior, there was a man who had been pushed to the edge by the very same greed that had cost so many others their peace. "He was destroying us," Wellington hissed, the veneer of his polite persona shattering completely. "He didn't care. He bought the land, he bought the history, and he treated us like we were just part of the scenery he wanted to replace. You don't understand, Hamish. You just stand there and watch. But you don't live here. You don't know what it's like to lose everything." "I know what murder is," Hamish said, his tone turning hard as flint. "And I know that no matter what the motive, you don't get to choose who lives and who dies just because you're angry. You took his life, and you used the village's resentment to cover your tracks. That wasn't justice, Wellington. That was just hate." Wellington lunged. It was a desperate, clumsy move, a frantic scramble to escape the inevitable. He didn't expect the lanky, perpetually slouching policeman to be anywhere near as fast as he was. Hamish caught the man's arm, pivoting with a strength that belied his thin frame, and slammed him against the heavy oak desk. The force of the impact shook the room, sending a stack of old papers flying into the air. Wellington struggled, his boots scraping against the wooden floor, but Hamish held him firmly, his hand pinning the manager against the desk with iron control. The man's rage burned out as quickly as it had ignited, leaving him gasping for air, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his defeat. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely broken. "It's over," Hamish said, his voice echoing in the small office. "You're done." Wellington let out a long, shuddering sob, his body going limp in Hamish's grip. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by the crushing weight of the inevitable. Hamish reached into the drawer, pulled out a pair of handcuffs, and clicked them firmly around the manager's wrists. The cold, metallic snap was the final definitive sound of the night. Hamish stood back, his chest heaving slightly, the adrenaline beginning to ebb away. He looked down at the man he had once considered a friend, a man he had shared countless cups of tea with, and felt a profound, aching sadness. The village would never be quite the same again, and the quiet peace he had fought so hard to protect had been irrevocably stained. But for now, the threat was gone. The truth was pinned to the floor, and the long, grueling night was finally coming to an end. He sat Wellington down on the cold floor and picked up the phone to call the station in Strathbane. The task ahead of him now being the only one that truly mattered, keeping his own name out of the headlines. The morning sun crept over the jagged teeth of the mountains, painting the mist in shades of pale, bruised violet. Outside the police station, the air was sharp enough to cut. But inside, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating scent of burnt coffee and official. Self-important rage. DCI Blair was back, his face a mottled, vibrant shade of purple that suggested a man on the verge of a spontaneous combustion. He paced the small, cramped office, his heavy boots echoing like drumbeats against the floorboards, while Mr. Wellington sat shackled to the sturdy wooden chair in the corner, staring blankly at the floor. "I can't believe it," Blair roared, stopping to glare at Hamish, who was currently slumped in his chair, looking for all the world like a man who hadn't slept for a week. "You sat on this. You had the perpetrator under your nose while I was busy dealing with the nephew. You absolute, bumbling, incompetent wretch." Hamish blinked slowly, letting his jaw hang just slightly open to complete the effect of bewildered fatigue. "I didn't know for sure, Chief Inspector. I was just checking a few things. It was mostly luck, really. I was just in the right place when he came back to." "Well, finish the job." Blair's eyes bulged. He snatched the official report from the desk, scanning it with a frantic intensity. Hamish had been meticulous in his manipulation. He had written the report in a style that was almost aggressively boring, dull, bureaucratic, and peppered with enough self-deprecating remarks to make it clear that he had merely stumbled upon the truth by sheer, unadulterated accident. He had framed the investigation in such a way that it seemed as though Blair's own pressure and presence had forced Wellington into a desperate, panicked move. "You're telling me," Blair hissed, leaning over the desk so far that his nose was almost touching Hamish's, "that you don't want to claim any credit for this? This is a major arrest, Macbeth. This is the kind of thing that makes careers. You could be looking at a transfer, a commendation, perhaps even a promotion to sergeant in a proper high-crime district." Hamish shuddered, a motion that was entirely genuine. The thought of a promotion of a life in the smog-choked streets of a city was enough to make his skin crawl. "Oh, no, sir. Heavens, no. I'm just a simple village constable. I'd be lost in the city. The paperwork alone would finish me off. Besides, it was your team that really secured the perimeter. I just happened to be here, having a cup of tea." Blair paused, his rage momentarily diverted by a sudden, surging wave of ego. He looked at Hamish, then at the shackled prisoner, and finally at the report. A slow, gratified smile began to spread across his face, replacing the purple flush with a smug, oily satisfaction. He was a man who lived for the pat on the back, for the glory that filtered down from the higher-ups, and he wasn't about to turn down a gift-wrapped win. "Well," Blair said, smoothing his jacket and puffing out his chest, "I suppose that's true. My presence, the sheer weight of the police force, must have pressured him. He knew the net was closing. You were just the administrative vessel for the arrest." "Exactly, Chief Inspector," Hamish agreed, his voice dripping with sycophantic humility. "The brilliance was all in the strategy. I just held the cuffs." Blair nodded, clearly sold on his own narrative. "Right. Well, I'll be taking credit for this. Naturally, I'll make sure the Commissioner knows that it was my oversight that led to this successful conclusion. And you, Macbeth, well, stay out of trouble. Try to keep this place from falling apart. I don't want to hear about any more murders in Lochdubh. It's bad for the statistics." "I'll do my best, sir," Hamish said, watching Blair strut toward the door, already mentally composing his victory speech for the local press. As the squad cars pulled away, the sound of the sirens dying out into the distance, Hamish stood up and stretched his long, aching limbs. The station felt quiet, hollowed out, but for the first time in days, it felt like his own again. He walked over to the larder, retrieved the salmon he had hidden away before the madness began, and placed it on the stove. He didn't need the glory. He didn't need the promotion or the city lights. He needed the silence of the glens, the taste of a fresh-caught meal, and the comforting, predictable rhythm of a life that was far too boring for anyone to notice. He sat down, opened a fresh tin of coffee, and listened to the wind outside. The storm had passed, the village was quiet, and Hamish Macbeth was, once again, the laziest, smartest, and most content policeman in the entire Highlands. He was home, and for now, that was more than enough. The morning sun, now fully crested over the peaks, bathed Lochdubh in a deceptive, golden tranquility. It was the kind of morning that made the previous 48 hours of sirens, shouting, and high-stakes tension feel like a fever, dream a dark, jagged interruption in the otherwise smooth, slow-moving river of village life. Hamish Macbeth stood on the small wooden jetty by the water, the air tasting of brine and wet heather. He had finished his salmon, the last morsels of which had been shared with a particularly demanding lugs. And now he was simply watching the water lap against the weathered pilings. The village was waking up. He could see Mrs. Jesperson hanging out her washing, her movements sharp and rhythmic, and catch the faint, savory scent of curry spices already beginning to drift from Ali Patel's shop. For the rest of the world, a murder had been solved. DCI Blair was likely at this very moment standing in the canteen at Strathbane, basking in the glow of the commissioner's praise, detailing how his meticulous investigation had flushed out a killer in the remote hamlet of Lochdubh. The newspapers would carry the story, a brief, sensationalized account of a greedy hotel manager and a tragic property dispute. And then, as quickly as it had arrived, the interest of the outside world would evaporate. But for Lochdubh, the aftermath was more complex. Mr. Wellington had been a fixture of the village for years, a man who had poured their drinks, listened to their grievances, and occupied the center of their social sphere. His betrayal was not something that would be forgiven quickly. It was a wound that would need time to scab over. Hamish knew the whispers would continue in the church pews and the shop queues for months to come. The hidden motive of shared misery had been exposed, and the community would have to confront the uncomfortable reality of how close they had all stood to that same dark precipice. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, the resilience of the Highlands began to reassert itself. The tragedy, as profound as it was being slowly absorbed into the tapestry of village history. The Lochdubh people were endurance masters. They had survived centuries of harsh winters, economic hardship, and the shifting tides of politics. They would survive the loss of their hotel manager and the shattering of their illusions. Hamish felt a strange, quiet contentment settle over him. He had navigated the storm without losing his footing, and more importantly, without drawing the unwanted attention that would have surely uprooted him from his life. He had used his wits, played his part, and returned to the shadows where he felt most at home. He looked at his badge, pinned to the lapel of his worn tunic, and felt not the weight of duty, but the lightness of having successfully avoided a transformation. He whistled for Lugs, who was currently busy sniffing at a discarded crab shell, and began the slow, meandering walk back toward the police station. The day stretched before him, vast and gloriously empty. There were no suspects to chase, no angry inspectors to appease, and no looming deadlines to meet. He might spend the afternoon mending the fence in his garden, or perhaps he would head up to the high ridge to see if the cloudberry bushes were showing any early fruit. The choices were his own, and they were blissfully inconsequential. As he reached the door of the station, he paused, looking out over the loch one last time. The water was perfectly still now, a mirror reflecting the vast, indifferent beauty of the sky. The peace had returned, but it was a different kind of peace, a wiser, more seasoned quiet. He pushed the door open, the familiar, comforting smell of coal dust and old books greeting him. He sat in his chair, springs groaning in a welcome that felt like a long-lost friend. He reached for the kettle, his movements slow and deliberate. The cycle of his life in Lochdubh had not been broken. It had been tested, confirmed, and ultimately preserved. He would remain the local Bobby, the man who was just a little bit too slow and a little bit too distracted to be considered a threat to anyone's ambition. He would continue to poach his salmon, to nurse his coffee, and to listen to the things that were left unsaid in the village gossip. He poured his tea, the steam curling into the cool air of the office, and closed his eyes. The Highlands were harsh, unforgiving, and deeply isolated. But they were his, and he was theirs. He was a guardian of secrets, in a place where the mountains kept their own. And as the sun began to climb higher, promising a day of absolute, unadulterated stillness, Hamish Macbeth allowed himself a small, private smile. The world was complicated, the people were flawed, and the truth was rarely as clean as one might hope. But for today, the coffee was hot, the station was quiet, and he was exactly where he wanted to be. He was the constable of Lochdubh, and he was finally home.